Hello, and welcome to Changing Times, Loughrea Memorial Group Virtual Conference. This conference, Changing Times, has been organised by Galway County Council's Heritage Office in partnership with Loughrea Memorial Group. It is an action of Galway County Council's Decade of Commemoration Strategy 2013 to 2023. The conference is funded by Galway County Council and the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media under the Community Strand of the Decade of Centenaries programme. In this video, Dr. Conor McNamara will discuss James Daly and the Indian Mutiny of the Connacht Rangers in 1920. Dr. Conor McNamara has published widely on the Irish War of Independence and has previously worked at NUI Galway, the National Library and the University of Minnesota, Ireland programme. He is the author of a series of studies of the War of Independence, including War and Revolution in the West of Ireland, Galway, 1913 to 1921, published in 2017, and Lee Mellow's Soldier of the Irish Republic, Selected Writings, 1914 to 1922, published in 2018. He is the native of Athenry, County Galway, and currently lives in New York. This is Galway Soldiers Who Defied the Crown.
Today I'm just going to give a brief lecture, maybe in less than half an hour or so, on the Connacht Rangers mutiny of 1920 in northern India. It's been the focus of quite a lot of attention this year with its centenary. And what I'd like to do today actually is just discuss the Galway connections to the mutiny. The Connacht Rangers, of course, were garrisoned in Renmore Barracks in Galway City since their inception, and it was seen very much as a Galway regiment. So I'd like to pose the question today then, to what extent could we look at it as a Galway mutiny? What percentage of soldiers, for instance, what proportion of them were from Galway, and what became of them after the mutiny? So my specific focus today is on the veterans of the mutiny, and particularly those from Galway, and their lives after events in India. So the Connacht Rangers mutiny of June 1920 involved several hundred men and non-commissioned officers of the 1st Battalion of the Connacht Rangers, and as many as 400 at its peak, who were stationed in the far north of India at Wellington Barracks in Jalandhar in the province of Punjab. It's often referred to as Jalandhar in British sources, and spreading to a mountain station at Solan on the foothills of the Himalayas in the state of Himachal Pradesh, over 100 miles north. The mutiny began on Monday the 28th of June and lasted less than a week, involving the men grounding their arms and refusing to serve under their officers in protest at the actions of the British administration in Ireland. In the summer of 1920, of course, we had the Black and Tans dispatched to Ireland, subsequently the Auxiliaries, a force of over 14,000 men to supplement the regular RIC. And almost immediately we have atrocities associated with lawlessness, drunkenness, murder and wanton violence witnessed across Ireland. And it is these actions that motivate the men to refuse to serve under a British flag. And in fact, they would go on to declare themselves as soldiers of the Irish Republic. The protest was largely peaceful until the night of Thursday, the 1st of July at Solan, when a group of rebels, led by Private James Daly, who was born in Ballymoe in County Galway, fearing an attack on their positions, attempted to storm the barracks magazine to gain access to the weapons stored within. 2 mutineers were killed in this incident and another seriously wounded. Daly, of course, would go on then to be the last British soldier executed for mutiny in the armed forces. And he was executed almost this day 100 years ago on the 2nd of November 1920 at Decade, India. By the end of the week, all of the mutineers had been arrested. The committed hardcore were isolated from their loyal colleagues and interned in Decade prison to await their court-martials. No officers were involved in the mutiny, and the men who took part were overwhelmingly privates, with a significant number of lance corporals and one sergeant, Joseph Woods. Private Patrick Smith of Drogheda, County Louth, and Private Peter Sears of the Neil, County Mayo, died in the incident at Solon, led by James Daly, and a third soldier, Eugene Egan from Claremorris, County Mayo, was seriously wounded. No British soldiers or officers were hurt in the affair, and in the aftermath of the mutiny, as I say, James Daly was to be executed on the 2nd of November. The final victim, actually, of the affair was John Miranda, who was actually an Englishman from Bootle in Liverpool. He had been imprisoned for his role where he took part in the mutiny out of solidarity with his Irish comrades, and he actually died in jail of typhoid on the 26th of December 1920, and his remains remain in the jail yard at Dagside. The leaders and hardcore of unrepentant mutineers numbered more than 80 men and were court-martialed and subsequently sentenced to long periods in prison, ranging from execution and life imprisonment to jail for 5 years, between 21 and 5 years, with hard labour. These men, however, minus 5 of their number, were transferred to jails across England in January 1921, principally Maidstone Jail, and their sentences subsequently reduced upon review. The Irish Civil War was in its most violent phase in early 1923, when an agreement was reached between the new Free State and the British administration that would see British forces indemnified against prosecution for their actions in Ireland earlier in the conflict. In return, as part of the agreement, the Connacht Rangers, held at Maidstone Jail and elsewhere, were to be released home and their sentences quashed. The men returned towards the end of January 1922 to much popular acclaim at home, while the Irish Civil War raged. So who were these men and where were they from? Well, the Connacht Rangers had been based at Renmore Barracks since the amalgamation of 2 existing regiments in 1879. The regiment was a traditional avenue out of poverty for the rural poor across the west of Ireland, playing the same role as the Royal Munster Fusiliers in Tralee, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers in the capital, and so on. Local people did identify with their local regiments, took pride in their actions, and followed their escapades in the local newspapers. For most young men, farmers' sons or the urban poor, there was nothing political then about joining the Connacht Rangers or any other regiment of the army, certainly up until the aftermath of the 1916 Rising. And in many places, particularly Galway, the regiment was held in high esteem by the local community, certainly up until the atrocities of the Black and Tans. Young men joined the regiment for adventure and for economic reasons, and to escape the tedium and servitude of rural labouring. During World War I, the escapades of the regiment were widely reported with pride in the Connacht Tribune, the Tuam Herald and other newspapers, and the lists of the dead that were published initially were printed with a degree of pride and self-congratulation. Both of the regiment's regular battalions, in fact, served in the war, with 4 additional battalions formed in 1914. The Connacht Rangers saw service at some of the most iconic battles of the conflict, including Ypres, the Somme and Gallipoli, as well in more far-flung theatres of war, including Egypt, Palestine and the Mesopotamia campaign. The 1st Battalion of Connachts, who were concerned with the mutiny in India, had been stationed in Karachi before the war erupted in 1914 and were subsequently posted to the Western Front. The 2nd Battalion had been based at Aldershot and took part in the original British Expeditionary Force that arrived at Boulogne on the 14th of August 1914. Due to heavy losses, the 2nd Battalion had been merged with the 1st in December 1914, and this combined battalion participated in the 1st Battle of Messines in October 1914 and the 2nd Battle of Ypres in April 1915. The 1st Battalion also subsequently fought in the Mesopotamia campaign. This background is particularly significant because what we're talking about involved in the mutiny is quite a storied regiment constituting quite hardened veterans of World War I. These are not young, raw recruits who mutiny in 1920. These are almost overwhelmingly veterans of the Great War who had fought through some of the most horrific conflicts, experiences, battles and so on of that conflict. And this will be a major factor when we analyse the background and context of the fighters. So in the aftermath of the mutiny, to go back to events in India, 88 or so mutineers from both companies at Solon and Jalandhar were tried by court-martial for their role in August and September of 1920. More than 15 were sentenced to death, in fact, with Private Daly to be the only one actually executed by firing squad in Dagshai on the 2nd of November, with the others having their death sentence commuted to penal servitude for life. 59 of the soldiers were in fact sentenced for periods ranging from life to 22 years, with the remaining soldiers getting sentences of between 15 and 3 years imprisonment. The men were held in Dagshai jail from June 1920 until January 1921 under the most difficult and horrific of conditions in terms of mosquitoes, in terms of diet, and particularly, of course, in terms of heat and climate and so on. Again, what's important to contextualise at this point is that these are men with long military records, as we'll see, that have everything to lose by their participation in the mutiny in terms of their pensions. Their pensions being the primary motivation for most young men to actually join regiments of the British Army in the first place. In the absence of a substantial social welfare state, old age posed much fear and horror of impoverishment for ordinary working class people and the rural poor. And any pension of any consequence was the difference really between destitution and some form of a life in old age. So these men had everything to lose, not just horrifically hard prison sentences under harsh conditions for a very lengthy duration, but also for those who were less involved in the mutiny but would also be dismissed from the regiment without imprisonment or court-martial. You had the very significant loss of their pension in old age due to their dismissal being under the terms of ignominy, which meant they could no longer claim any benefits. So for those who were to return home, who we examine in a moment, a glimmer of hope came in 1936 in the form of the Military Service Pensions Act that was to be extended under the form of the Connacht Rangers Pension Bill by the Free State Administration. The Connacht Rangers Pension Bill legislated for the first time for a form of pension for men who had participated in the mutiny and who had been court-martialed and spent 12 months imprisonment or longer. These were the men that were eligible to an award. And this would be important as we examine the background and context of the veterans from Galway. The only men eligible for a pension, as I say, had to have been court-martialed. Less than 90 or so of the 400 who participated would then be eligible, and of those 90 or so, just those who had spent 12 months in confinement would be eligible. So this considerably reduced the number who could apply for a pension of those who had lost their British military pension. In addition to these restrictions, the widows and children of men could apply for an allowance of a deceased soldier who had satisfied the criteria. So these regulations were much less generous than the existing regulations applied to members of other organisations, Cumann na mBan, the Irish Volunteers, who had fought in the War of Independence, for example, as parents and other family members dependent on an applicant who was deceased were not eligible, other than widows and children. So in all, I'll just have a look at these numbers, In all, 258 applications were made to the Bureau of Military Service Pensions Department for pensions under the Connacht Rangers Pension Act of 1936. And to highlight how stringent the regulations were, of the 258 applicants, just 38 were awarded military service pensions for their actions in India. A further 12 were awarded gratuity payments, generally amounting to about one payment of £150, and 2 additional men were awarded disability pensions. Thus, 306 of the 258 veterans of the mutiny who applied were turned down as ineligible. The vast majority of these applicants came from men who had participated in the mutiny but had not been court-martialed, or in a lesser number of cases had been sentenced to less or spent less than 12 months in jail in Dagshai or in England. The latter group, we can say, are particularly hard done by, given how harshly treated by the British authorities in jails they were. So the importance of the Bureau of the Military Service Pensions is that their archives provide a social, economic, political snapshot of the veterans of the campaign. And these archives are now all available to download and to view on the website of the Military Archives. So what I'd like to do now is just give an overview of the participants in the mutiny through their own pension applications. But before we do that, it's important maybe to pause for a moment and think. We're on the 100th anniversary almost to the day of the execution of James Daly. So Daly was the leader of the mutiny in Solan. He had led a charge of his men unarmed, armed with bayonets, sticks and batons, on the magazine fort that held the rifles and ammunition in the barracks in an attempt to arm themselves on the night of Thursday, the final day of the mutiny. And Daly's a very interesting case. He's from a very tough background. He had joined the British Army in 1914, considerably under the legal age of enlistment, alongside 3 brothers and his father. The family were living in Tyrrell's Pass, County Westmeath, but they had actually spent the early portion of their lives in North Galway. I said Daly had been born in Ballymoe, where you believe his mother, who was Crehan, was from, a familiar name in that part of the world, and Daly also being a familiar name in the Mountbellew district, where the family had lived both in Mountbellew and Glenamaddy before moving to Ballymoe. And the father's original occupation had been that of a baker, in which he was employed in various locations in North Galway and subsequently in County Westmeath. So these are extremely unlikely. He's an extremely unlikely leader of what we might retrospectively term a Republican rebellion, that to throw off their allegiance to the crown and proclaim themselves soldiers of the Republic, and then to face execution for their actions. He had served 3 years in the World War I campaign whilst underage. His mother had in fact petitioned the War Office for her son to be brought home on the basis of his age, that he had gotten in by deceiving the authorities. He was brought home in 1917, stayed at home until he passed the legal age of enlistment, and rejoined in 1919 into the Connacht Rangers, and was very shortly dispatched to India. So this is a man whose father, whose brothers had all been through the campaign, as had he. He would have been entitled to a healthy pension by the standards of the working class at the time. This would be something that would protect them from destitution in their old age. And the family certainly had a proud history of combat and of the martial culture in which they had been part and parcel of their background. Daly had been held then in Dagshai jail. He was the only one of the prisoners whose death sentence wasn't commuted, and this is essentially retribution for the uprising at Solon, in which a number of prisoners were killed. We have quite a number of evocative material from the time, from his last moments, due to the actions of a Father Baker, who was actually the chaplain and administered to Daly in his final days in Dagside jail and at his final moments, actually, in his execution in the prison yard. And Baker made a copy of his experiences, of his reminiscences, and actually also of James Daly's last letter to his mother. Daly had been born, I should have mentioned, in 1899, which made him, his birth cert is slightly confused in different accounts, but he was 20 years of age at the time of his execution. And to quote from his final letter, passed for posterity by Father Baker, he said, he wrote, just the day before his death, "My dearest mother, I take this opportunity to let you know the dreadful news that I am to be shot on Tuesday morning, the 2nd of November. But what harm? It is all for Ireland. I'm not afraid to die. It is only thinking of you. If you will be happy on earth, I will be happy in heaven. I am ready to meet my doom. The priest is with me when needed. So you have no need to worry about me, as I am going to my dearest home, heaven. But I wish to the Lord that I had not started on getting into this trouble at all. I would have been better off. But it is done now, and I have to suffer. Out of 62 of us, I'm the only one to be put out of this world. I am ready now to meet it. God bless you all, hoping to see you someday in heaven. I hope, dearest mother, you won't be terribly put out about, but will keep a stout heart. I know it is hard on you, but what can be done?" What's very interesting in this letter again is his staunch approach to his death, but also his expression of regret that he had got involved in it, but at the same time being willing to die very much for Ireland at the same time. The second note we have very importantly from Father Baker was actually an account of Daly's last words to the execution, to the firing squad that executed him. Daly said to the men about to take his life, "You men don't know my mind. You might think I'm afraid to die. I'm not. And someday the men in the cells over there may be free, and you might meet them somewhere and say I died a coward. But there is one thing you might never be able to say, unless you tell lies, that you ever put a bullet through Daly's shirt." He had removed his shirt famously moments earlier so that he would be shot through his bare chest. So Daly was executed on the morning of the 2nd of November and his body interred in Dagside jail. And that seemingly was the end of the affair, with the prisoners returned to Maidstone prison and a number of other prisons in January of the following year. So in terms of the pension statements, it's very interesting to return to my first proposition. Can we call this a Galway revolt? We can claim with some justification that Daly, who'd spent his formative years in North Galway as an honorary Galway man, certainly. There is no concise list of the men who took part in the mutiny. However, we do have the concise list of the court martials. But when we look at the military witness statements, we have to note, first of all, that most participants in the mutiny did not apply to the Military Service Pensions Board in 1936. We think over 400 men certainly participated at some point, and we had, as I say, 250 applications. Secondly, the act took place, of course, nearly 17 years after the initial mutiny. Many of these men would have been deceased. Many had lived across the world, had settled in other parts of the United Kingdom, Ireland and elsewhere. They had to apply relatively quickly. The window closed within a year for applications. And then the days obviously before internet and modern communications. Many of these men would have been very slow to find out the details of the scheme. So then, 38 claims were received from men from Galway of the 258. So that makes less, we'll say, than 20% of the overall total number of claims coming from Galway. And of this number, if we exclude Daly, just 4 were from men living in Galway. That is, were granted pensions of this number. So 38 claims and 4 successful only from County Galway under the scheme. However, those that were rejected, as we'll see, were rejected on the grounds that they either weren't court-martialled and or didn't spend 12 months in jail, as opposed to not having participated or not having lost their military pension. So what I'd like to do is just do an overview of these 38. Some I can't linger on, just name them in alphabetical order. But it's interesting to look at the geographic dispersion of the Galway claims. And what you'll see is a number of clusters of claims, particularly in the towns and particularly in Ballinasloe, actually, which had had a long tradition of service in the military, was known by the somewhat disparaging term, I suppose, in retrospect, as a garrison town, where the urban poor had sought a way out of poverty simply by joining the local regiment. So, Padre Joseph Burkett was from 20 Beattiestown in Fairhill in Galway City, of course, which is the Claddagh. He had enlisted in the army at Renmore Barracks at the outbreak of World War I and had participated in the mutiny. He left an interesting pension. He served throughout the war and re-enlisted and demobilisation in 1919 and was sent to India, where the mutiny took place. In his colourful statement, he said, in 1917, while home on leave, he was investigated by his superior officers for taking off his army tunic and headdress and dancing on them in Eyre Square, and advising the young men of Galway town to join Sinn Féin and not the British Army. During the mutiny, he was with D Company at Jalandhar and had been imprisoned for 5 months awaiting court-martial. He'd been discharged with ignominy but had not been sentenced. Upon return to Ireland, he worked as a painter in Renmore Army Barracks for the National Army, but also claimed he got 5 minutes to clear out of the barracks, as I was amongst the most dangerous man to have in it. He subsequently worked as a labourer and casual painter. There may be a degree of retrospective exaggeration in Burkett's statement, but it's certainly interesting, his connection with the military and the National Army that remained. Martin Cawley came from Canal View in Ballinasloe. He had enlisted in the 4th Battalion initially of the Royal Irish Regiment in January 1918 and was discharged at the end of the war, subsequently joining the Connacht Rangers and serving at Jalandhar. He was discharged from the regiment in July 1922 when the regiment was fully demobilised. I should have said earlier, the Connacht Rangers were disbanded along with a number of other Irish regiments in 1922 upon the establishment of the Free State. On return to Ireland, Martin Cawley worked as a labourer on the roads with Galway County Council. Thomas Connell of Ardeven Mount Bellew had enlisted in the Connacht Rangers in January 1919 after the end of the war. He was held in confinement for 7 months following the mutiny and subsequently returned to Mount Bellew, where he worked as a postman. Frank Conley of Cook Terrace, Bohermore in Galway City had enlisted in the 1st Battalion of Connacht Rangers in August of 1918 and was stationed at Solon, where he took part in the mutiny. He spent 3 months in hospital after the events of June 1920, owing to the treatment he received, he noted, and later developed tuberculosis. He was discharged following this establishment of the regiment in 1922, and he also worked for Galway County Council on his return to Ireland and was hospitalised on 2 occasions for the tuberculosis contracted while in India. He later immigrated to York, England, like many of these men, and received no financial recompense from either state for his travails. Patrick Cox was from Middle Street in Galway City and was a Lance Corporal in the Connacht Rangers and had served from 1914 throughout the conflict. On demobilisation, he re-enlisted in 1919 and participated in the mutiny at Jalandhar. He was court-martialled, spent 6 months in confinement where he complained of severe malaria. He returned to Ireland in March 1921, having been discharged from the regiment. Like many of these men, as we'll see, he subsequently had to immigrate to the United States for work and settled in Sheridan Avenue in Albany, upstate New York, where he worked as a clerk in a brass moulder. And this experience is quite common, as we'll see. Men who return home either through a mixture of wanderlust, trauma, inability to get work, hostility perhaps from employers because of his service in the British Army, are forced to immigrate. And many live lonely, broken and desperate lives, and this is a very strong theme that emerges. John Daly of Aughrim was one of the 4 men to receive a military service pension. He enlisted in Northumberland Fusiliers at Ballinasloe in October 1914 and served throughout the war until the general mobilisation in 1919. He re-enlisted in the 1st Battalion Connacht Rangers and took part in the mutiny in Solon, court-martialed and was sentenced to 3 years in prison, later commuted to 2. He was imprisoned at Dagshai Jail in India before being moved to Waltham Jail, where he was subsequently later discharged from the force with ignominy. He was awarded a pension and worked as a labourer following his return to Ireland. He actually joined the National Army during the emergency during World War II, emergencies is termed often in Ireland, and was stationed at the Curragh. He was unmarried, suffered heart problems related to his service, and died in Aughrim in 1959. Martin Duran lived in Athenry. He enlisted in Galway in the 5th Battalion of the Connacht Rangers at the start of World War I. He fought in the disastrous campaign at Gallipoli in August 1915 and actually received shrapnel wounds on the Western Front at Chateau in October 1918. He re-enlisted following the war, served 2 months confinement in Dagshai Jail for his role in the mutiny, and was discharged when the regiment was disbanded in July of 22. John Derain from Green Gardens in Galway enlisted in Renmore Barracks in September 1919. Following the mutiny in which he participated, he was confined to barracks for 4 months and was subsequently discharged. He worked as a builder's labourer following his return to Galway. Martin Derrick was from College Road in Galway, and he enlisted in the Connacht Rangers in April of 1919. There's contradictory evidence regarding his participation in the mutiny. The secretary of the Connacht Rangers Committee, J.J. Horgan, stated that he was not one of the mutineers. However, he does appear in the original schedule of court-martials of soldiers who mutinied at Solon, where he is listed as holding the rank of boy. Following the mutiny, he spent 7 months in jail and was discharged from the regiment upon disestablishment in July 1922. Like so many of these men from Galway, he subsequently immigrated and lived at Elizabeth Road in Coventry in England for his remaining years. John Fairs was from Grange in Tuam. He enlisted in Claremorris, County Mayo upon the outbreak of the war in August 1914. He participated in the mutiny in having rejoined the regiment and served at Jalandhar as a member of C Company and was interned for 4 months after the uprising, during which time he developed malaria in Dagshai Jail. He remained in the regiment and was discharged in July 1922 upon demobilisation. Like so many of these men, when he returned to Ireland, he worked as a labourer on the local roads and for farmers. Private Patrick Hines, next, was from Lawrencetown and also from Harbour Street in Ballinasloe. He was one of the 4 who received a pension. He was born in 1899 in Lawrencetown, enlisted for service in World War I with the 4th Battalion Connacht Rangers in November 1914 and had transferred to the Leinster Regiment. He served throughout the war and re-enlisted again in 1919 and participated in the mutiny at Solon. He was in fact sentenced to death for his role in the events, with his sentence subsequently commuted to penal servitude for life. He was transferred from Dagshai Jail in January 1921 and held in Maidstone Prison with the rest of the mutineers and was released in January 23. Upon his return to Ireland, he served in the Civic Guard from March of 1923, that is the Garda Síochána, until September 1924. But again, a recurring theme and a recurring city. Like so many others, he subsequently left Ireland and lived in Coventry, England, where he lived with his wife and family. However, he returned to Ballinasloe to work as a labourer on the bog scheme with the County Council in 1941. He was awarded a short service pension for his role in the mutiny. He died on Christmas Eve 1972, so he lived a long life, and his wife Kathleen actually lived until 1988, until she passed away at Bedford in Warwickshire. Patrick Kilderry, like so many others, was from Haymarket Street in the town of Ballinasloe. He enlisted at Dunmore Police Barracks in January of 1920, the year of the mutiny, and took part in events at Jalandhar. He was held for 6 weeks following the mutiny, was discharged at the disestablishment of the regiment in July of 22 and returned again, like so many men, to work as a labourer in his hometown. Martin Knight was from Pulla in Williamstown and served in the British Army during World War I. He re-enlisted again following demobilisation, served during the mutiny at Jalandhar and was charged with mutinous insubordination and disobedience. However, he was not court-martialed. Following his return to Ireland, he worked as a farm labourer, but again, in a recurring theme like so many of the men, he suffered from ill health. In 1961, he wrote to the Military Service Pension Board, having been repeatedly refused a pension, that "I am unable to work and I have no fixed place of abode." Knight in this respect would bully a number of men that became homeless and in dire circumstances afterwards. John J. Lynch then also was one of the 4 men who earned a pension. He was from Ardana in Roscommon and was later an inmate in St. Bridget's Hospital in Ballinasloe, one of a number of men who were in the mental asylum in Ballinasloe. He'd enlisted in the Connacht Rangers in Boyle in January 1916 and was sent to France, fought throughout the campaign, was demobilised and rejoined the regiment in 1919. He had been court-martialed following the mutiny at Jalandhar and sentenced to 10 years penal servitude, later commuted to 5 years. He was imprisoned along with the other mutineers at Defied Jail, India, before being brought to England in January 1921 and held in Portland Jail and Maidstone Prison. He was released in 1923 with the rest of the mutineers and immigrated to New York. There he worked at Seton Hospital in Manhattan as a porter and lived in a number of addresses across the city. He was awarded a military service pension for his role in the mutiny and returned to Ireland in the early 1960s. His end was a sad one, however, and in 1964 he was admitted as a voluntary inpatient in St. Bridget's Hospital, Ballinasloe, and died there on the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising in 1966. Lawrence Madden of Listivy, Milltown, enlisted in the Royal Irish Regiment in February of 1918 at Ballinasloe, served during the latter part of the war, re-enlisted with the Connacht Rangers and participated in the mutiny at Jalandhar. He was one of 100 or so mutineers that were enclosed in a barbed wire compound for several days in scorching heat, and a number of whom succumbed to severe heat stroke. He stated in his pension application that he offered his services to the IRA on his return to Ireland and subsequently wandered about until 1922, when sheer hunger compelled me to join the National Army. He was discharged from the National Army 2 years later in 1924 and subsequently worked on the railroads. James Minogue of Bowland Street, Gort, joined the Connacht Rangers in Galway at the end of the war and spent 5 years, having spent 5 years in the Army Reserve. Following the mutiny, he was confined for 4 months at Jalandhar, discharged, sent back to Ireland in 1921. While in confinement after the mutiny, he received a severe beating around the head with a rifle by his guard and suffered ill health for the rest of his life and was certified as only able for light work. He was married and had 4 children. Thomas Monaghan of Balgaddy Road, Tuam, enlisted in the Connacht Rangers in September 1916 and served throughout the war until demobilisation in 1919, when he re-enlisted in the Connacht Rangers. He was a member of A Company and was imprisoned for 14 weeks in Defied Jail. On his return to Galway, he worked as a labourer and was a married man. John or Jack Mulkerns was from Craig and Oughterard. He had enlisted at the start of the war at Renmore Barracks in Galway and served in the Leinster Regiment until his discharge in 1919, when he re-enlisted in the Connacht Rangers. He was not court-martialed, but was held in confinement until November 1920. He returned to Ireland during the Civil War and served with the 4th Brigade, 1st Western Division of the National Army. He was wounded on active service during the Civil War when he accidentally shot himself at Abbeyfield in Limerick in February 1923 and was discharged as medically unfit. He was later initially denied a military pension for his wound on the basis that his experience in the military meant that he should have known better than to have accidentally shot himself. He later worked as a labourer and became an inpatient, like a number of these men, at the county home in Loughrea in the 1930s, where he died. A very interesting case is that of Patrick Murphy of Currandulla. He was born in 1877, so he was much older than many of the men. But he, on his return to Ireland, was actually killed during the Civil War while on active service with the National Army in a Republican attack at Carramore Hill near Newport, County Mayo, on the 24th of November 1922. He was garrisoned at Westport at the time, and 4 other national soldiers were killed in the same engagement with the IRA. Prior to joining the National Army, he had served with the 1st Battalion of Connacht Rangers and was stationed with B Company at Solon and had actually rebelled under James Daly during the mutiny. His parents, Delia Moon and Patrick Murphy, had married in Tuam in 1896, and his mother later lived with the Miss Cohen at Woodford. Martin Nee was from Renville in Connemara. He enlisted in Clifton in April 1918 and took part in the mutiny as a member of D Company at Jallander. He was not court-martialed but was detained in close confinement for 6 months in Dagshy and later suffered from what doctors diagnosed as nervous disability and depression due to his treatment. He was discharged from the regiment upon disbandment with the recommendation that he was reliable, hard-working and sober. He immigrated to Pittsburgh, like so many of the men, where he lived at Madison Avenue and worked in the steel industry and as a freight handler. Robert Nugent was from Poolboy Cottages in Ballinasloe. He enlisted in the Rangers in September 1919 and took part in the uprising at Solon and participated under James Daly in the attack on the Magazine Fort. He was transferred to a different barracks following the mutiny and discharged in 1922 from the regiment. Like a number of other men, he went on to work as an attendant at St. Bridget's Hospital, Ballinasloe, upon his return to Ireland. Patrick O'Donoghue was from Boland Street in Gort. He had fought and was the final man among the list to receive a pension. He enlisted in the regiment in January 1917 at Renmore Barracks and was discharged after the war in August 1919, but re-enlisted once again. He had actually fought in the Battle of Ypres, during which he sustained shrapnel wounds to his back and was treated at Boulogne Hospital. For his participation in the mutiny, he was court-martialed and sentenced to 2 years' labour. While interned in Woking Jail, he suffered gastric problems, headaches and weakness and was permanently unable to work when he returned home. It was noted by his local member of Dáil Éireann, S.P. Keeley, in 1932 that he was almost destitute and is suffering from physical and mental maladies which call for immediate medical assistance. He is rapidly on the road to insanity, his local TD petitioned the Military Service Pension Board, and has already hinted at ending his miserable life by suicide. This was written in 1933 by his TD. I think I have suffered my share for Irish freedom, O'Donoghue wrote, as I laid down my gun in India thousands of miles from my native land in support of the cause and forfeited my good pension, which I would be in receipt of if I had loyal to Great Britain. I am now treated as if I am an outlaw. Archdeacon Cassidy of Gort wrote to the Military Service Pension Board in 1934. Punishment for his actions was so harsh that ever since he is broken in health and unable to work, he has simply to live at present on a few shillings of home assistance that he received. O'Donoghue spent a short time in the National Army upon his release, and it was hoped by his friends that he would be made a patient at St. Bricken's Military Hospital in Dublin. He was an inpatient at the Central Hospital in Galway in 1932 before, like a number of other of these men, being transferred to the county home in Loughrea. He was awarded a short service military pension of 10 shillings in 1936 and died shortly after, 5 years later, in 1941. He was aged just 43. His funeral expenses had to be paid by the local Gort LDF, Local Defence Forces. Finally then, John Oliver was from Loughrea. He was a career soldier, having joined the military early in his life in 1905. He served throughout World War I in northern France and served at Ypres in 1914. He enlisted during the general mobilisation in 1919 and was stationed at Solon during the mutiny. He was court-martialed for his role and sentenced to life imprisonment, commuted to 16 years in jail. Held at Dagshy until January 1921, he was transferred with the other imprisoned men to England and held at Maidstone Jail. He suffered from ill health upon his return to Loughrea in 1923. He subsequently descended into severe depression and a number of other related illnesses. And on the 18th of January 1932, aged just 44, he took his own life. Other soldiers then of note of the 38 that I have mentioned included Valentine O'Neill, who served as a Garda upon his arrival at Aircourt for a number of years. He had originally come from Ballina in his native Mayo. Interestingly, his application for a pension was supported by the Republican commander Michael Kilroy, of all people, who noted that, "I feel it is of a shame to have men like O'Neill overlooked for so long." John Quinn was from the Athenry Road in Tuam. He was denied a pension, and having served in the mutiny at Jalandhar, upon his return to Ireland, he served as a labourer. He worked as a labourer and had 7 children. Due to his experiences, or perhaps exacerbated by his experiences, he suffered severe facial eczema and had heart problems, and was diagnosed as unable to work in the 1920s. Finally then, Martin Ruffley was from Lower Abbey Street in Galway. He had served for 19 years in the Connacht Rangers before the mutiny. He was originally listed in the list of court martials, but however he wasn't proceeded against. He worked like many of the men as a labourer when he returned home, and he was amongst that very unfortunate group that forfeited their British military pension without having ever gained one for their role in the mutiny from the Irish Free State. His pension would have amounted to nearly 20 years in the British Army. Then Richard Stretch was from Clencoon in Glenamaddy. He was confined after the mutiny at Jalandhar, where he suffered from malaria and fever, and stated that he had, upon return, he could not find permanent employment. He joined the Irish Republican Army. However, during the Civil War, he served with the National Army and was stationed with the 2nd Western Division at Castlereagh, County Roscommon, until November of 1923. The final men that I just have to mention, then Thomas Tierney was from Mellows Road in Bohermore. He was one of the original 90 prisoners listed for court-martial, but charges were not proceeded against him. He, like so many, had to leave to seek work in England. Michael Mongan, of no fixed abode, Bridge Street in Tuam, was his address, but he stated he was homeless. Also applied for a pension for his role, but details are sketchy in his application. A number of prisoners then finally, or ex-participants who didn't pursue their claims after having applying, were John Carr of 4 Henry Street, Galway, Joseph Nocton of 2 Middle Street, Galway, Christopher McDonough of Flood Street, Galway, Edward Monaghan of the County Home in Loughrea, Timothy Hines of Newbridge in Nobellew, Matthew Curran of Ballywilliam and Spiddle, and Patrick Morgan of Ballydangan, Ballinasloe. In conclusion then, the popular acclaim that Rita Daly later, following his memory, following his execution when he was reinterred in Ireland on the 50th anniversary of the mutiny, did not extend to the veterans from County Galway. The vast majority faced ill health, dire finance, and in many cases broken lives, immigration, insecurity, and a number of cases the county home and the mental hospital. We cannot call this a Galway revolt either. This was a nationwide, the soldiers from across Ireland, particularly prominent alongside Galway, were soldiers from Mayo, from Roscommon, from Limerick, and from actually counties the length and breadth of Ireland. There was no glory in being a mutineer, and there certainly was very, very few that gained any financial compensation. And as almost a rule, the men suffered in health and financial wise upon their return to Ireland. There was little popular acclaim for the ordinary soldiers, and in many cases they actually became outcasts and misfits in their own community. Gormagat.